For a century, the name Gucci has stood as the ultimate global shorthand for Italian luxury, craftsmanship, and style. It is a brand synonymous with the Made in Italy Renaissance, an empire of leather and silk that adorns the shoulders of movie stars and the feet of kings. From the interlocking GG logo to the iconic bamboo-handled bags, Gucci is a monument to aesthetic perfection. But behind the velvet ropes and the glossy storefronts lies a family history so stained with jealousy, greed, and violence that it rivals the darkest tragedies of Shakespeare. The House of Gucci was not destroyed by a competitor or a market crash. It was devoured from within. It is a story of a patriarch who pitted his sons against one another, of brothers who sent each other to prison, and of a black widow who hired a hitman to murder her ex-husband on the steps of his own office. The Gucci family built one of the most valuable brands in human history, but in their relentless pursuit of control, they lost everything: their company, their freedom, and eventually, their lives. The founder, Guccio Gucci, was born in Florence in 1881 into a modest family of craftsmen. His father was a hat maker who struggled to make ends meet in a city that was slowly losing its Renaissance luster. Guccio, ambitious and restless, chafed under the limitations of his father's small shop. In 1897, after a bitter argument that bankrupted the family business, the teenage Guccio fled Italy. He did not run away to join a circus or an army. He ran away to join the service industry. He boarded a steamer ship bound for London, seeking his fortune in the capital of the British Empire. He found work at the Savoy Hotel, the most luxurious and modern hotel in the world at the time. It was the first public building in London to be lit entirely by electricity and the first to install electric lifts. For the young Italian immigrant, it was a revelation. Guccio started at the very bottom, working as a dishwasher and eventually rising to the position of elevator operator. It was inside the mahogany-paneled lift of the Savoy that Guccio received his true education. For nearly 20 years, he spent his days ferrying the global aristocracy, kings, industrial tycoons, opera stars like Enrico Caruso, and politicians like Winston Churchill up and down the hotel's floors. He did not just push buttons, he observed. He studied their clothes, their manners, and most importantly, their luggage. He noticed that the wealthy did not just carry bags, they carried symbols of their status. Their trunks were made of fine leather, embossed with initials and crests, sturdy enough to withstand the rigors of steamship travel, but elegant enough to be carried by a valet. He saw the intricate bridle leather of the English hunting set, the sturdy saddlebags of the polo players, and the refined travel cases of the diplomatic corps. He realized that for the elite, luggage was not utilitarian. It was an extension of their identity. In 1919, after the end of World War I, Guccio returned to Florence. He was now 40 years old, armed with a small amount of savings and a massive amount of insight. He married Aida Calvelli, a dressmaker's daughter, and adopted her son Ugo. Together, they had 5 more children: Grimalda, Enzo, Aldo, Vasco, and Rodolfo. This brood would become the workforce and eventually the warring factions of his empire. In 1921, Guccio opened his first shop on Via della Vigna Nuova in Florence. It was a small luggage shop, but Guccio had a vision that went beyond selling suitcases. He wanted to combine the refined, aristocratic aesthetic he had absorbed in London with the master craftsmanship of Tuscany. Florence had a centuries-old tradition of leatherworking, but it was largely rustic. Guccio elevated it. He hired the best local artisans and instructed them to make bags that looked English, sturdy, equestrian-inspired, and impeccably finished. His timing was perfect. The 1920s saw the rise of the automobile and a boom in European travel. The wealthy, both Italian and foreign, flocked to Florence. They came for the art, but they left with Guccio's bags. He shrewdly positioned his brand to appeal to the equestrian set, incorporating horsebit and stirrup motifs into his designs. A visual language that implied nobility, even if the buyer had never ridden a horse. But Guccio was not just a craftsman, he was a cunning political survivor. In 1922, Benito Mussolini marched on Rome, and Italy fell under fascist rule. While many businesses suffered under the regime's isolationist policies, Guccio adapted. When the League of Nations imposed trade sanctions on Italy in 1935 following the invasion of Ethiopia, leather became scarce. A lesser businessman might have closed shop. Guccio innovated. He forced his artisans to experiment with non-traditional materials. They began to use hemp, linen, and jute, materials that were cheap and Italian-grown. They printed these fabrics with a distinctive pattern of small, interconnected dark brown diamonds on a tan background. This became the Diamante canvas, the precursor to the famous GG monogram. It was a design born of necessity, a way to save leather, but Guccio marketed it as a chic, lightweight alternative for the modern traveler. The Second World War brought even greater challenges. As Allied bombs fell on Italian factories and leather supplies vanished completely, the Gucci workshop was again forced to improvise. In 1947, amidst the rubble of post-war Italy, Guccio's artisans created a bag that would become the brand's first global icon. They took a piece of low-grade pigskin and, lacking leather for a handle, they heated and bent a piece of Japanese bamboo cane into a semicircle. The bamboo bag was born. It was weird, it was innovative, and it was undeniably elegant. It captured the spirit of the times, a mix of exoticism and austerity. Guccio didn't apologize for the materials. He celebrated them. The bamboo bag became an instant hit with the returning wave of American tourists and Hollywood stars filming in Rome. Ingrid Bergman carried one in Viaggio in Italia. It was the first proof that Gucci could turn scarcity into luxury. But while Guccio was building a brand, he was also building a powder keg within his own home. He ruled his family with the same iron fist he used in his workshop. He was a classic tyrannical Tuscan patriarch. He believed that competition bred strength, and he intentionally pitted his three sons, Aldo, Vasco, and Rodolfo, against one another. He belittled them, played favorites, and encouraged them to spy on each other. He openly favored Aldo, his eldest and most commercially brilliant son, while dismissing Rodolfo, the youngest, who had initially pursued a career as a film actor under the name Maurizio D'Ancora. He largely ignored his daughter Grimalda, denying her a share in the company solely because of her gender, a decision that would lead to the family's first, though certainly not last, legal battle. This divide-and-conquer parenting style created a toxic dynamic that would fester for decades. The brothers learned to view each other not as partners, but as rivals for their father's affection and the company's assets. They were united only by their fear of Guccio. By the early 1950s, Guccio was in failing health, but the business was booming. The shop in Florence had expanded to Rome and Milan. The American market, hungry for European luxury, was beckoning. Aldo, seeing the future, begged his father to let him open a store in New York. Guccio, conservative and provincial, refused. He famously told his sons, "Stay small to remain great." He feared overexpansion and distrusted the Americans. But Aldo was his father's son, stubborn and ambitious. In 1953, defying Guccio's wishes, Aldo secretly traveled to New York and secured a lease for a shop in the Savoy Hotel on Fifth Avenue. It was a symbolic full circle. The empire that began in the Savoy, London, would now plant its flag in the Savoy, New York. Guccio never saw the American triumph. He died in Milan on January 2nd, 1953, just months before the New York boutique officially opened its doors. His death removed the lid from the pressure cooker. He left the company to his three sons, Aldo, Vasco, and Rodolfo, in equal one-third shares. The patriarch was gone, but his legacy was a double-edged sword. He had left them a thriving brand built on resilience and craftsmanship, but he had also left them a family culture rooted in jealousy, secrecy, and conflict. The brothers were now equal partners, but they had never learned to be equals. As they stood over their father's grave, the golden age of Gucci was about to begin, but the civil war that would destroy it had already been declared. To fully understand the curse that would later consume the family, one must look beyond the glossy narrative of the bamboo bag and examine the darker, more compromised foundations of Guccio Gucci's success during the fascist era. The golden age of Italian craftsmanship was, in reality, forged in the shadow of Benito Mussolini's dictatorship, and Guccio's navigation of this period revealed a moral flexibility that would become a hereditary trait. While post-war marketing materials would paint Guccio as a romantic artisan who defied the odds, historical records suggest a more complex reality. He was a pragmatic opportunist who understood that in a totalitarian state, survival meant collaboration. During the 1930s, as Mussolini pushed for economic self-sufficiency, Guccio did not merely endure the regime's restrictions, he capitalized on them. He supplied boots and leather goods to the fascist military and colonial administrators, securing lucrative government contracts that kept his workshops humming while his competitors failed. The Diamante canvas, often cited as a design triumph, was also a political one, a symbol of Italian self-reliance that aligned perfectly with the regime's propaganda. This willingness to bend with the prevailing political wind, to service the black shirts of the 1930s just as readily as he would service the Hollywood elite of the 1950s, established a corporate culture that prioritized survival and profit over ideology. Furthermore, Guccio was actively engaged in myth-making, a dark art of branding that his sons would later perfect. The Gucci family crest, a shield featuring a knight carrying luggage, was eventually marketed as proof of the family's ancient noble lineage as saddlers to medieval courts. In reality, it was largely a fabrication. Guccio's father was a humble hat maker, and Guccio himself had learned about horses not from breeding them, but from parking the carriages of the wealthy at the Savoy. This insecurity about their origins, the former estate agent syndrome seen in the Barclay family, ran deep in the Gucci blood. They were tradesmen desperate to be seen as aristocrats, a dissonance that fueled their obsession with image and status. The toxicity of the family dynamic was also cemented in these early years through the specific psychological torture Guccio inflicted upon his sons. He did not view his children as a team. He viewed them as a gladiator pit. Aldo Gucci, the eldest son born in 1905, bore the brunt of this pressure. He was the workhorse, the visionary, the one who physically built the business alongside his father. He spent his youth traveling across Italy with samples, charming shopkeepers, and sourcing leather. He believed, with some justification, that he was Gucci. Rodolfo Gucci, born in 1912, was the polar opposite. Handsome, slender, and uninterested in leather, he abandoned the family business in his 20s to become a film actor. Under the stage name Maurizio D'Ancora, he achieved moderate fame in the white telephone comedies of the Italian cinema era. Guccio publicly mocked Rodolfo's acting career as frivolous and effeminate, yet he also envied the glamour it brought to the family name. When Rodolfo finally returned to the fold after the war, largely because his film career had stalled, Guccio handed him a share of the company equal to Aldo's. This decision was the original sin of the succession. Aldo, who had swept the floors and built the supply chain, was forced to treat Rodolfo, the failed actor who had spent the war years on movie sets, as a peer. The resentment this bred was volcanic. Aldo viewed Rodolfo as a parasite. Rodolfo viewed Aldo as a peasant. The third son, Vasco, was the peacemaker, largely because he cared more about hunting and collecting art than business. But the most dangerous exclusion was that of the daughter, Grimalda. Grimalda had worked in the shop for years. She had kept the books during the war and secured funding from her husband to keep the factory open during the hardest bombing raids. Yet when Guccio drafted his final will, he adhered to an archaic Tuscan code of male primogeniture. He left the entire business to the three sons. Grimalda received a small cash settlement and a plot of land, but 0 shares. She fought back. In the early 1950s, as Guccio lay dying, Grimalda launched the first of what would be hundreds of Gucci lawsuits. She demanded to be recognized as an equal heir. Her brothers, united for the first and last time, crushed her. They successfully argued in court that a woman could not lead a business of such international stature. Grimalda was erased from the corporate history, her contribution liquidated for pennies. This betrayal set a precedent. In the house of Gucci, blood meant nothing when placed on the scale against equity. The death of Guccio in 1953, therefore, was not just the passing of a founder, it was the breaking of a dam. The patriarch who had terrified them into cooperation was gone. The empire was now divided into 3 fiefdoms. Aldo took control of the foreign expansion and marketing. Rodolfo took control of the Milan shop and the brand's image. And Vasco oversaw the production in Florence. They were rich, they were ambitious, and they were officially orphans. But they were also sitting on a gold mine. The post-war economic miracle, il miracolo economico, was exploding in Italy. The world wanted la dolce vita, and thanks to the foundation Guccio had laid, however compromised and contentious, Gucci was perfectly positioned to sell it to them. The stage was set for the golden age, but the actors who stepped onto it were already hiding daggers beneath their bespoke suits. The death of the founder, Guccio Gucci, on January 2, 1953, marked the closing of the company's artisanal prologue and the opening of its imperial main act. The entity he left behind was a successful, respected, but ultimately provincial Tuscan firm, generating revenues in the low millions and serving a predominantly European clientele. It was his eldest son, Aldo Gucci, who would take this raw material and alchemize it into the first true global luxury monopoly of the modern era. If Guccio was the stern patriarch who laid the bricks, Aldo was the visionary architect who imagined the cathedral, and for the next nearly 30 years, he would rule as the undisputed emperor of Italian fashion. Aldo's reign began with a gamble that his father had explicitly forbidden. In the final months of Guccio's life, Aldo had traveled to New York City against his father's wishes. Guccio, a conservative man who remembered the financial ruins of the 1930s, believed in the motto, "Stay small to remain great." He distrusted debt, distrusted expansion, and deeply distrusted the Americans. Aldo, however, possessed a different kind of intuition. He understood, with a clarity that bordered on prophecy, that the post-war center of gravity had shifted across the Atlantic. He saw that the new American aristocracy, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, and the Kennedys, possessed a hunger for status that the staid, gray flannel traditions of British and French luxury could not satisfy. They wanted something tactile, something romantic, something Italian. In late 1953, just weeks after his father's funeral, Aldo opened the first American Gucci boutique in the Savoy Plaza Hotel on East 58th Street. The location was symbolic. The empire that had begun in the elevators of the Savoy London was now planting its flag in the Savoy, New York. The opening was not just a retail event, it was a cultural detonation. At a time when American luxury was defined by the rigid formalism of department stores, Aldo offered a slice of la dolce vita. The store was designed to feel like a private Florentine palazzo, walnut cabinets, velvet chairs, and the intoxicating, pervasive scent of expensive leather. Aldo, with his shock of white hair, his impeccable English, and his kinetic salesman's charm, personally worked the floor. He kissed the hands of socialites, charmed the wives of tycoons, and told romantic stories about the family's history as saddlers to medieval courts. He famously declared, "I am the first Italian ambassador to the United States," and in the context of commerce, he was right. He single-handedly rebranded Made in Italy from a tag meaning rustic and cheap to a tag meaning sophisticated and sexy. But Aldo knew that charm alone would not build a billion-dollar business. He needed a product that bridged the gap between the old world and the new. He found it in a shoe. In 1953, coinciding with the New York launch, Aldo designed and released the horsebit loafer. It is difficult today, in a world saturated with luxury sneakers and casual wear, to understand just how radical this object was at the time. In the 1950s, men's footwear was strictly bifurcated. You wore stiff, laced Oxfords with a suit, or you wore canvas sneakers for sport. There was no middle ground. Aldo created the middle ground. He took a moccasin construction, soft, unlined, slip-on, which was traditionally considered too casual for business, and he elevated it. He made it out of the finest, saddle-grade leather that molded to the foot. He dyed it in deep, rich cordovans and blacks. And then, the master stroke. He placed a small golden metal snaffle bit across the vamp. It was a piece of design genius. The gold bit signaled aristocracy and equestrian leisure, while the soft leather signaled comfort and modernity. It was a shoe that said the wearer was rich enough to own a horse, but relaxed enough to not wear laces. It became the uniform of the American century. It was worn by Clark Gable and John Wayne. It was worn by Wall Street bankers who wanted to signal their cosmopolitanism. It was worn by the Ivy League set. It was the first sportswear luxury item, a product that allowed the American elite to buy into the fantasy of Italian nobility for the price of a shoe. In a moment of supreme cultural validation, the Gucci loafer would eventually be the only shoe added to the permanent collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, enshrined not just as fashion but as significant 20th century industrial design. As the 1950s bled into the 1960s, Aldo's ambition grew. He realized that to become a true global empire, he needed to capture the female market with the same intensity. He needed a bag that could rival the Hermes Kelly. In 1961, he reintroduced a hobo-style bag that had been in the archives. It was a soft, slouchy unisex shoulder bag made of canvas and leather, featuring a distinctive piston-shaped closure. It was elegant but functional, designed for the modern woman who traveled, not the lady who lunched. The bag found its muse in Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. The former First Lady, then the most famous woman in the world, was photographed constantly by the paparazzi. In image after image, getting off a jet in Capri, walking on Madison Avenue, shielding her face from flashbulbs, she was clutching this Gucci bag. It became her shield and her signature. Recognizing the power of this endorsement, Aldo officially renamed the product the Jackie, It was a masterclass in celebrity marketing before the term existed. He didn't pay Jackie O to wear the bag. He simply created a product that fit her life so perfectly that she became his billboard. Sales exploded. The Jackie became the essential accessory for the jet set, the new class of wealthy nomads who wintered in Gstaad and summered in Saint-Tropez. But Aldo's greatest contribution to the world of fashion branding, and perhaps his most profitable invention, was not a shoe or a bag. It was a logo. In the mid-1960s, honoring his father in the most commercial way possible, Aldo designed the interlocking GG. Prior to this, luxury brands relied on their names or crests. Aldo's designed two inverted Gs, facing each other, often enclosed in a circle or woven into a repeating geometric pattern, was something new. It was a graphic symbol that could be stamped, printed, or cast in metal. Aldo slapped the GG on everything. It appeared as a gold buckle on belts, as a clasp on handbags, and, most famously, woven into a coated canvas material. This was the birth of logomania. Aldo understood a fundamental psychological truth about the new money of the 1960s and 70s. His customers didn't just want to own the quality, they wanted to display the cost. They wanted a shorthand that signaled to everyone across the airport lounge that they had arrived. The GG canvas allowed a secretary in London to carry the same status symbol as a princess in Rome. It democratized the image of luxury while maintaining the price of exclusivity. This logo canvas, which was significantly cheaper to produce than leather but sold for nearly the same price, became the financial engine of the company, generating profit margins that were unheard of in the leather trade. By 1968, Gucci was no longer just a company, it was a cultural phenomenon. It had opened stores in Palm Beach, Chicago, and Beverly Hills. The Rodeo Drive store opening was a riot of celebrity, attended by Elizabeth Taylor and Rita Hayworth. The brand had permeated the zeitgeist. Frank Sinatra famously insisted on having his Gucci loafers polished before he went on stage. Samuel Beckett, the playwright of existential dread, was photographed carrying a Gucci bag, proving the brand had conquered the intellectuals as well as the socialites. However, this expansion required a business structure that could support it. Aldo, realizing that the Florentine workshops could not keep up with the global demand, pioneered a system of vertical integration and subcontracting that would become the model for the Italian fashion industry. He didn't just build bigger factories, he built a network. He identified the best artisan families in Tuscany, belt makers in Santa Croce, metal workers in Florence, tanners in Pisa, and signed them to exclusive contracts. He provided them with the materials, the designs, and the quality standards, and they provided the labor. This allowed Gucci to scale up production rapidly without sacrificing the Made in Italy label. It was a flexible, decentralized factory floor that spanned the entire region of Tuscany. Aldo ruled over this network like a feudal lord. He was obsessive about quality control. He would famously make surprise visits to the workshops, inspecting the stitching on a handbag with a magnifying glass. If a seam was crooked, he would cut the bag apart with a knife in front of the terrified artisan. He instilled a culture of perfectionism that bordered on terror, ensuring that even as the company mass-produced tens of thousands of loafers, each one still felt like it had been made by hand for a prince. While Aldo was busy conquering the New World and restructuring the supply chain in Tuscany, his brother Rodolfo was playing a critical, albeit more passive role in Milan. Rodolfo was the yin to Aldo's yang. If Aldo was the kinetic salesman who pushed the brand into the future, Rodolfo was the melancholic guardian of its past. A former film actor who had starred in over 40 movies under the name Maurizio d'Ancora, Rodolfo possessed a natural cinematic understanding of glamour. He managed the flagship store on Via Monte Napoleone not as a retail space, but as a stage set, a temple of exclusivity where the sales staff were trained to treat customers with a haughty, aristocratic reserve that only increased the brand's allure. It was under Rodolfo's watch and through his connection to the world of celebrity that the company achieved one of its most legendary marketing coups, a moment of serendipity that would birth yet another icon. In 1966, Princess Grace of Monaco, the former Hollywood star Grace Kelly, walked into the Milan boutique. She was at that moment perhaps the most photographed and emulated woman in the world. Rodolfo, charmed and starstruck, insisted that she choose a gift as a token of the family's esteem. She politely declined, but Rodolfo pressed, asking if she might like a scarf. When she agreed, asking for one with a floral pattern, Rodolfo froze. To his horror, he realized that Gucci, known for its severe masculine aesthetic of leather and horse bits, did not have a single floral design in its inventory. Refusing to let the princess leave empty-handed or disappointed, Rodolfo improvised. He immediately called Vittorio Accornero, a famous Italian illustrator and set designer. He commissioned Accornero to create the most beautiful floral scarf imaginable, and he needed it immediately. Accornero worked through the night, producing a masterpiece. The design, dubbed Flora, was a lush, vibrant explosion of 43 varieties of flowers, berries and insects, butterflies, dragonflies, and beetles, rendered in 37 colors with the precision of a 17th century botanical textbook. When Rodolfo presented the finished silk scarf to Princess Grace, she fell in love with it. She wore it constantly. The Flora print became an instant sensation, softening the brand's hard equestrian image and introducing a romantic feminine vocabulary that expanded the customer base overnight. It was a perfect example of the Gucci magic during this golden era, a collision of Italian craftsmanship, Hollywood glamour, and royal patronage that money simply could not buy. The print became a permanent code of the house, adorning everything from handbags to dresses for the next 50 years. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, Aldo's vision expanded beyond the West. He possessed a geopolitical foresight that his French and British competitors completely lacked. While brands like Louis Vuitton and Hermes were content to serve Europe and America, Aldo looked east. He saw the rising economic power of post-war Japan and the emerging wealth of the Asian tigers. In 1972, Gucci became the first Italian luxury fashion house to open a boutique in Tokyo in the Ginza district. 2 years later, in 1974, they opened in Hong Kong. The move was derided by European snobs, but it was a financial masterstroke. The Japanese market, with its cultural appreciation for craftsmanship, logos, and gift-giving, embraced Gucci with a fervor that bordered on obsession. The Asian expansion opened a fire hose of revenue that would eventually account for nearly a third of the company's global profits. Aldo had successfully transformed a Florentine leather shop into the first truly multinational luxury corporation, with a footprint that spanned the entire industrialized world. By the mid-1970s, the Gucci machine was printing money. Historical financial analyses from the Financial Times estimate that the company's global revenues had climbed from mere millions in the 1950s to nearly $500 million by the end of the decade. The margins were astronomical, particularly on the canvas goods, which were essentially plastic-coated cotton sold at leather prices, and on a new, incredibly lucrative product line, perfume. In 1974, Aldo launched Gucci No. 1, the brand's first fragrance. The perfume business was the final piece of the empire. It allowed customers who couldn't afford a $500 handbag to buy a $50 bottle of scent and still feel like they were part of the club. It was liquid profit, with margins approaching 90%. To manage this, Aldo created a new subsidiary, Gucci Parfums, a structural decision that would have devastating consequences. He used the perfume division to funnel cash to different parts of the family, creating a complex web of ownership that was designed to minimize taxes but ultimately maximize suspicion between the brothers. Aldo Gucci was now in his 70s, and he was the undisputed sun king of the luxury world. He traveled the globe constantly, a tireless emperor inspecting his colonies. He was rich, powerful, and revered by the industry. To the outside world, the House of Gucci was a monolith of Italian success, a seamless blend of family tradition and corporate efficiency. But inside the family, the golden age was a facade. The empire was rotting from the inside out. The fatal flaw was not in the business model, but in the biology. Guccio Gucci had pitted his sons against each other, and now Aldo and Rodolfo were inadvertently doing the same to the next generation. The three sons of Aldo, Giorgio, Roberto, and Paolo, and the single son of Rodolfo, Maurizio, were grown men, now in their 30s and 40s. They had lived their entire lives in the golden cage of the family business, raised on stories of their grandfather's cruelty and their father's rivalries. They were wealthy, but they were powerless. Aldo, in his arrogance, made a critical error. He brought his sons into the company, giving them titles and salaries, but he refused to give them authority. He treated them as glorified assistants. He mocked their ideas and dismissed their ambitions. He believed he would live forever, or at least rule forever. He did not see that he was creating a nest of vipers who were desperate for recognition and hungry for control. The most volatile element in this generational pressure cooker was Paolo Gucci. Aldo's second son was the creative soul of the family, a talented but eccentric designer who had served as the company's chief stylist in the late 60s. Paolo chafed under his father's conservative saddlery aesthetic. He looked at the exploding fashion scene of the 1970s, the rise of Armani and Versace, and he wanted Gucci to modernize. He wanted to expand into ready-to-wear clothing, to create a younger, more vibrant line. Aldo crushed him. He forbade Paolo from modernizing the brand, terrified of alienating the core conservative clientele. "We are not a fashion company," Aldo famously roared in board meetings. "We are a leather goods company." He belittled Paolo publicly, calling his designs tasteless and cheap. On the other side of the family, Rodolfo was equally destructive, but in a different way. After the death of his wife in 1954, Rodolfo had retreated into a fortress of grief in his Milan estate. He focused all his controlling neurotic energy on his only son, Maurizio. He treated Maurizio not as an heir, but as a possession. He controlled his money, his friends, and his career, terrified that the shy, bespectacled law student would be corrupted by the world. When Maurizio fell in love with Patrizia Reggiani in the early 70s, Rodolfo saw his worst fears realized. He viewed Patrizia as a vulgar social climber and famously warned Maurizio that if he married her, he would be disinherited. Maurizio, in a rare act of defiance, married her anyway, leading to a years-long estrangement that only ended when Aldo, the pragmatic uncle, intervened to bring the nephew back into the fold. By the late 1970s, the tension in the boardrooms of Florence and New York was palpable. The golden age was ending not because sales were down, they were higher than ever, but because the family could no longer stand each other. The cousins were plotting. The brothers were suspicious. The structure of the company, divided between the two surviving patriarchs, was a stalemate waiting to be broken. The cracks began to show publicly in 1978. As the brand became ubiquitous, quality control began to slip. The market was flooded with Gucci products. The GG logo, once a sign of discernment, was starting to look common. Counterfeiters were having a field day, and the family was too busy fighting over dividends to stop them. The exclusivity that Rodolfo had cultivated in Milan was being eroded by Aldo's mass-market ambition in America. The brand was dangerously close to becoming a caricature of itself, a symbol of nouveau riche excess rather than aristocratic taste. But the true end of the era arrived not with a bad quarter, but with an act of rebellion. In 1980, Paolo Gucci, pushed to the breaking point by his father's mockery, decided he had had enough. He made a secret move that would shatter the family's code of silence and ignite the Civil War. He didn't just want a raise, he wanted his own name. In 1980, Paolo Gucci moved from resentment to open insurrection. Operating in deep secrecy, he bypassed his father and uncle entirely. He designed a full collection of leather goods, clothing, and home furnishings, but instead of presenting them to the board, he incorporated his own independent company abroad. He registered the trademark Paolo Gucci in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, jurisdictions he believed were beyond the immediate reach of his father's legal team. When Aldo discovered the betrayal later that year, the reaction was nuclear. He did not view this as a business dispute. He viewed it as a violation of the family's sacred code. Aldo immediately fired Paolo from every position he held within the Gucci empire, stripping him of his vice presidency of Gucci Shops Inc. and his directorship at Gucci Parfums. But firing him was not enough. Aldo wanted to erase the threat. He sued his own son in American and Italian courts, obtaining injunctions to block the Paolo Gucci trademark. He argued that the name Gucci belonged to the company, not to the individuals born with it. Paolo, cut off from his salary and humiliated, fought back with the desperation of a cornered animal. The conflict escalated rapidly from legal filings to physical violence. The tension exploded on July 14th, 1982, during a board meeting at the company's headquarters in Florence. The agenda was meant to be routine, but the air was thick with hatred. Paolo arrived with a tape recorder, intending to document his father and uncle's refusal to let him work. When Aldo saw the device, he snapped. What followed was a scene of indignity that signaled the definitive end of the Golden Age. According to police reports and witness testimony, the meeting dissolved into a brawl. Shouts turned to shoves. In the chaos, a heavy tape recorder was hurled across the mahogany table. It struck Paolo in the face. Blood streamed down the cheek of the Gucci heir. Paolo stumbled out of the boardroom, his shirt stained red, screaming to the shocked employees in the hallway, "They tried to kill me." He did not go to a hospital. He went to the police. He filed formal assault charges against his brothers, Roberto and Giorgio, and his 77-year-old father, Aldo. The headline in the Italian papers the next day was devastating: Gucci versus Gucci. The veil of aristocratic dignity that Aldo had spent 30 years curating was ripped away. The world now saw the family not as refined Florentine artisans, but as a dysfunctional clan of brawlers. While the assault charges were eventually dropped, the damage was done. The family was irrevocably fractured. Yet a fragile stalemate remained because the ownership structure was still balanced. Aldo and his sons controlled 50% and Rodolfo controlled 50%. As long as the two patriarchs lived, neither faction could destroy the other. But in May 1983, the biological clock ran out. Rodolfo Gucci, the reclusive former actor who had guarded the brand's prestige in Milan, died of cancer. His death was the earthquake that the fault lines had been waiting for. Under the laws of succession, Rodolfo's entire 50% stake in the Gucci empire passed to his only child, Maurizio Gucci. Overnight, the power dynamic of the last 3 decades was obliterated. Aldo Gucci, the man who built the global empire, the man who opened New York and Tokyo, the man who was synonymous with the brand, was suddenly, mathematically, vulnerable. He controlled only 40% of the shares directly. Maurizio, the nephew Aldo had viewed as a shy, malleable boy, Il Mao, now held the controlling block. Maurizio was 35 years old. He had been groomed by Aldo, but he was now being coached by his wife, Patrizia Reggiani. Patrizia saw the 50% stake not as a responsibility, but as a weapon. She whispered in Maurizio's ear that it was time to stop bowing to his uncle. She urged him to assert his birthright. The golden age of expansion and unity was officially dead. The company was now a house divided, paralyzed by a 50-50 split between a domineering uncle and a resentful nephew. To break the deadlock, Maurizio realized he needed a defector. He needed someone from Aldo's side of the family to cross the line. He looked at Paolo. He saw the scar on Paolo's face from the boardroom brawl. He saw the lawsuits Aldo had filed against his own son. Maurizio realized that Paolo's hatred for his father was stronger than his loyalty to his branch of the family. In late 1983, the 2 cousins, Maurizio and Paolo, met in secret. They forged a pact that would have been unimaginable to their grandfather Guccio. Maurizio offered Paolo a deal. If Paolo used his small 3.3% stake to vote with Maurizio, they would have a combined majority of 53.3%. They could outvote Aldo. They could fire the king. In exchange, Maurizio promised Paolo the one thing he wanted more than money: creative freedom. He promised that once they took control, he would allow Paolo to launch his own designs. It was a lie, but it worked. The alliance was sealed. As the year 1983 ended, the trap was set. Aldo Gucci, sitting in his office in New York, believed he was still the master of the universe. He did not know that his son and his nephew had already signed his execution warrant. The era of empire building was over. The era of the coup had begun. The year 1984 marked the point of no return for the House of Gucci. The boardroom skirmishes and legal threats of the previous few years had been mere skirmishes. Now the family was engaged in a total existential war. The alliances were formed, the knives were sharpened, and the objective was clear: the decapitation of the king. Aldo Gucci, now 79 years old, still sat at the head of the table, confident in his invincibility. He believed he could control his rebellious son Paolo through legal intimidation and his inexperienced nephew Maurizio through psychological dominance. He was wrong on both counts. He did not realize that the 2 marginalized men had formed a secret pact to destroy him. The coup took place in a boardroom in Florence in October 1984. It was a masterclass in corporate patricide. Maurizio Gucci, utilizing the 50% stake he had inherited from his father Rodolfo, joined forces with Paolo Gucci. Paolo, fulfilling his end of their secret bargain, cast his crucial votes against his own father. The motion was passed. Aldo Gucci, the man who had built the empire, the man who had taken the brand from a small shop to a global icon, was formally stripped of his chairmanship. He was ousted from the company he had ruled for 30 years. Aldo's reaction was volcanic. He did not go quietly. He declared war on his nephew, whom he now referred to only as that crazy boy. He launched a scorched earth legal counteroffensive, filing lawsuits in Italy and the United States to block the boardroom vote. But his most dangerous weapon was personal. Aldo knew the family skeletons better than anyone, and he decided to rattle them. He tipped off the Italian financial police, the Guardia di Finanza, about a potential crime committed by Maurizio. Aldo alleged that Maurizio had forged his father, Rodolfo's signature on the stock transfer certificates to avoid paying millions of dollars in Italian inheritance taxes. It was a nuclear option. If proven, Maurizio would not only lose his shares, he would go to prison. The Italian authorities, sensing a high-profile scandal, opened an investigation. In 1987, acting on Aldo's tip, the police issued an arrest warrant for Maurizio Gucci. Maurizio tipped off just minutes before the police arrived at his Milan palazzo, fled on a motorcycle. He crossed the border into Switzerland, beginning a humiliating exile as a fugitive from Italian justice. From his sanctuary in St. Moritz, he continued to fight for control of the company, but his position was precarious. The empire was now leaderless, with one pretender in exile, and the old emperor fighting to regain his throne. But while Aldo was busy destroying his nephew, he failed to watch his back. He had forgotten about Paolo. Paolo Gucci had helped Maurizio overthrow Aldo, but he felt cheated. Maurizio had promised to let him launch his own design line, but once in power, Maurizio had reneged, realizing that a cheap Paolo line would devalue the main brand. Paolo, betrayed by his father and now betrayed by his cousin, decided to burn the entire house down. He knew Aldo's deepest, darkest secret. For decades, Aldo had been diverting millions of dollars of profits from the American shops into offshore sham companies in Panama and the Caribbean to avoid paying U.S. taxes. It was a sophisticated skimming operation that had gone undetected for years. In a final act of vengeance that echoed the darkest Greek tragedies, Paolo Gucci walked into the office of the Internal Revenue Service in New York City. He handed over boxes of documents, ledgers, memos, and financial records that proved his father's tax evasion. It was the ultimate betrayal. A son handing his own father to the authorities. The U.S. Attorney in New York, Rudolph Giuliani, who was making a name for himself prosecuting the mafia and white-collar criminals, took the case. The evidence provided by Paolo was irrefutable. In January 1986, Aldo Gucci, the grand patriarch of Italian fashion, pleaded guilty to evading $7 million in U.S. taxes. The sentencing hearing was a spectacle of tragedy. Aldo, now 81 years old, stood before the judge. He was a broken man. He told the court, "I forgive my son. I hope he finds peace." But the law was unforgiving. Aldo was sentenced to 1 year and 1 day in federal prison. The image was seared into the public consciousness. The elegant, white-haired emperor of luxury, handcuffed and led away to a federal penitentiary in Florida. It was the nadir of the Gucci name. The brand that symbolized glamour was now synonymous with tax fraud and family treachery. While Aldo sat in a prison cell, Maurizio Gucci, who had eventually been cleared of the forgery charges and returned from Switzerland, finally seized total control. In 1988, he made a decisive move to consolidate his power and pay off the warring family factions. He brought in an outside investor, InvestCorp, a Bahrain-based investment bank. Maurizio convinced InvestCorp to buy out his relatives. In a massive multi-million-dollar deal, InvestCorp purchased the shares of Aldo and his 3 sons. The check was written. Aldo Gucci walked away with over $100 million, but he lost the thing he loved most, his company. He died just 2 years later, in 1990, a wealthy but bitter man, destroyed by the ambitions of the family he had created. By 1989, Maurizio Gucci was the last man standing. He had defeated his uncle Aldo. He had outmaneuvered his cousins. He owned 50% of the company, and he was the undisputed chairman. He had won the Civil War. But winning the war is not the same as ruling the kingdom. Maurizio had spent his life fighting for the company, but he had no idea how to run it. He was about to prove that the only thing more dangerous than a Gucci fighting for power was a Gucci who actually had it. The conclusion of the Gucci Civil War in the late 1980s was not a peace treaty. It was a massacre of the old guard. While Maurizio Gucci stood victorious in the boardroom, flush with Investcorp's cash and absolute authority, the relatives he had vanquished were left to face the ruinous consequences of the conflict they had waged. The years 1989 and 1990 served as a tragic epilogue to the lives of the men who had built the empire, a period where the curse of the family seemed to manifest in its most literal and devastating form. Aldo Gucci, the titan who had conquered America, did not enjoy his forced retirement. After his release from federal prison in 1987, he spent his final years as a king in exile. The $100 million buyout he received from Investcorp was a fortune, but to a man whose identity was entirely fused with his company, it was blood money. He had lost his life's work to the nephew he had once mentored and the son who had betrayed him. In January 1990, at the age of 84, Aldo died in Rome. His death marked the symbolic end of the era of craftsmanship and expansion. He had built the House of Gucci, and he died watching strangers and traitors living in it. But the fate of Paolo Gucci, the man who had tipped off the IRS and destroyed his father to gain his freedom, was even more pathetic and harrowing. Paolo had believed that by helping Maurizio overthrow Aldo, he would finally be free to launch his own design empire. He was wrong. Maurizio, once secure in power, had no intention of letting a tacky Paolo Gucci brand dilute the main image. Maurizio and Investcorp blocked Paolo at every turn. Paolo spent his final years in a spiral of manic litigation. He sued everyone, his cousins, his ex-wives, his lawyers. He spent his buyout money on a chaotic mix of bad investments and legal fees. In a final cruel twist of irony, the man who had sent his father to prison for tax evasion was himself imprisoned in New York for failing to pay child support. By the early 1990s, Paolo was bankrupt. He died in London in 1995, just months after the murder of Maurizio, alone and destitute. His pigeons, his beloved hobby, were reportedly evicted from his stables because his estate could not afford to feed them. The creative visionary of the family had destroyed the dynasty to launch a brand that never existed. With his rivals dead or defeated, Maurizio Gucci entered the 1990s as the undisputed master of the universe. He was 41 years old, handsome, wealthy, and free. He controlled 50% of one of the world's most famous luxury brands. He had a vision, one that was, on paper, brilliant. He wanted to purge the brand of the cheap image it had acquired in the 1980s. He wanted to stop selling $10 keychains and canvas bags in duty-free shops. He wanted to return Gucci to the ultra-exclusive, high-end artisan roots of his grandfather Guccio. To execute this vision, he made a hiring decision that would change the course of fashion history. In 1989, he hired Don Mello, the legendary president of Bergdorf Goodman, to be his creative director. Mello, in turn, hired a young, unknown Texan designer named Tom Ford to oversee women's ready-to-wear. It was a stroke of genius. Maurizio was assembling the team that would eventually save the brand. By 1990, the Civil War was over. Maurizio Gucci stood alone at the summit, the sole survivor of the generational conflict. He had exiled his uncle, defeated his cousins, and secured the crown. But in the tragedy of the Gucci bloodline, victory is often just a prelude to disaster. Maurizio had won the war for the company, but he was about to face a far deadlier battle, one that would cost him not just his fortune, but his life. The final act of the Gucci family tragedy began not with a gunshot, but with a signature on a contract. By the early 1990s, the civil war that had consumed the previous decade had effectively cleared the battlefield, leaving Maurizio Gucci as the sole survivor, the undisputed king of the empire his grandfather had founded. He had exiled his uncle Aldo to prison and his cousin Paolo to bankruptcy. He possessed absolute power, 50% of the shares, and the chairmanship. But as history has repeatedly proven, the skills required to seize a throne are rarely the same skills required to keep it. The period from 1990 to 1993 was characterized by a slow, agonizing corporate suicide, a self-inflicted financial collapse that would strip the family of its birthright forever and set the stage for the violence to come. Maurizio's vision for the company was, in retrospect, prophetically correct. He understood before anyone else that the future of luxury lay in exclusivity, not mass production. He saw that the brand had been cheapened by Aldo's saturation strategy, the thousands of licensed products, the plastic lighters, the duty-free keychains. He declared a scorched earth policy on the brand's own inventory. He ordered the cancellation of hundreds of licensing deals and slashed the product range from 22,000 items down to just 5,000. He wanted fewer goods, higher prices, and a return to the artisanal perfection of the Florentine workshop. To execute this aesthetic revolution, he had assembled a dream team. Don Mello, the retail genius he hired from Bergdorf Goodman, had brought with her a young, unknown Texan designer named Tom Ford. Inside the design studio, magic was beginning to happen. Ford was reimagining the Gucci look, stripping away the staid, equestrian conservatism and injecting a dose of raw, 1970s-inspired sex appeal. The creative engine of the company was finally, after years of stagnation, revving up. However, while the design studio was living in the future, the finance department was dying in the present. Maurizio managed the company's accounts with the casual disdain of an aristocrat who believes money is a renewable resource. He treated the corporate treasury as an extension of his personal wallet. While sales plummeted, a predictable short-term result of cutting product lines, spending exploded. He poured tens of millions of dollars into a new palatial headquarters on Via delle Calde in Milan. He insisted on the finest marble, the most expensive lighting, and a level of architectural grandeur that the shrinking revenue could not support. More egregiously, he blurred the lines between corporate assets and personal toys. His pride and joy was the Creole, a magnificent 200-foot wooden schooner he had purchased. It was the largest wooden sailing yacht in the world. Maurizio spent millions of the company's money restoring it to museum quality, staffing it with a full-time crew, and treating it as a floating symbol of the new Gucci lifestyle. To the auditors, however, it was just a hole in the water into which he was pouring the company's liquidity. By 1992, the situation was catastrophic. The company was losing tens of millions of dollars a year. Suppliers in Florence, artisan families who had worked for the Guccis for generations, were not being paid. The banks were calling in loans. The brand was technically insolvent. This terrified Investcorp, the Bahrain-based investment bank that owned the other 50% of the company. They had backed Maurizio in 1988 to get rid of the chaotic Aldo, thinking they were installing a compliant modern executive. Instead, they found themselves locked in a partnership with a man they viewed as an incompetent playboy. The tension in the boardroom became toxic. Investcorp demanded cuts. Maurizio demanded patience. He arrogantly told the bankers that they didn't understand luxury, that he was building a dream that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. The bankers, however, understood math, and the math said Gucci was going bankrupt. In August 1993, Investcorp had had enough. They presented Maurizio with a brutal ultimatum: buy them out or they would buy him out. If he refused, they would stop funding the company, let it go into receivership, and wipe out his equity entirely. Maurizio tried frantically to find new investors to back him, to save his family's legacy. He traveled to Europe and the Middle East, pitching his vision, but his reputation preceded him. No one wanted to trust a Gucci with money. He was cornered. On September 27, 1993, in a conference room in Milan, Maurizio Gucci signed the papers. He sold his entire 50% stake in Guccio Gucci S.p.A. to Investcorp for $170 million. The moment the ink dried, a 72-year history ended. For the first time since Guccio Gucci opened his shop in 1921, not a single member of the Gucci family owned a single share of the Gucci company. The brand that bore their name was now the property of an Arab investment bank, soon to be managed by an American lawyer and a Texan designer. The family had been bought out, cashed out, and kicked out. Maurizio walked away from the closing with a personal fortune of roughly $170 million. He was fabulously wealthy, but he was devastated. He had lost the war his father had trained him for. He was a king without a kingdom, a man whose entire identity was wrapped up in a name he no longer owned. He retreated to his penthouse in Milan and his chalet in St. Moritz, trying to reinvent himself as a venture capitalist and a sportsman. He planned to open a casino in Switzerland. He planned to build a new business. But he was drifting. However, if Maurizio was depressed, his ex-wife, Patrizia Reggiani, was apoplectic. Patrizia had watched the sale of the company with a fury that bordered on madness. She had always identified herself not just as Maurizio's wife, but as Lady Gucci. She had been the one who pushed him to take power in the 1980s. She believed that the company was in part hers. She saw the sale to Investcorp not as a business transaction, but as a theft of her daughter's heritage. She famously declared to a reporter, "I am more Gucci than any of them." By 1994, Patrizia's life was consuming itself in bitterness. She was living in a luxurious apartment in Milan with her two daughters, Alessandra and Allegra, supported by a substantial alimony settlement. But it wasn't enough. She was obsessed with Maurizio. She tracked his movements. She called him incessantly, leaving terrifying raspy messages on his answering machine, screaming insults and threats. "You are a monster," she hissed in one recording that would later be played in court. "I want to see you dead." Her rage was fueled by two specific factors. The first was a medical crisis. In 1992, Patrizia had been diagnosed with a brain tumor in her frontal lobe. She underwent successful surgery to remove it, but she claimed, and her defenders would later argue, that the operation had fundamentally altered her personality, stripping away her inhibitions and magnifying her aggression. The second and more immediate factor was a woman named Paola Franchi. After leaving Patrizia, Maurizio had found love with Paola, a tall, elegant, blonde interior designer who was everything Patrizia was not: calm, discreet, and refined. They had been living together for years, and rumors began to swirl in Milanese society that Maurizio was planning to marry her. For Patrizia, this was the ultimate threat. Under Italian law, if Maurizio remarried, his alimony payments to Patrizia could be reduced. More importantly, if he had children with Paola, Patrizia's own daughters would see their inheritance diluted. The $170 million fortune that Maurizio had just cashed out would be split with a new family. Patrizia began to spiral. She was no longer just angry, she was hunting for a solution. She didn't hide her intentions. In the salons of Milan, at dinner parties, and even to her staff, she began to ask a chilling, open-ended question. She wasn't looking for a lawyer or a therapist. She was looking for a killer. "Is there no one in Milan?" she famously asked her circle of hangers-on. "Who has the courage to kill my husband?" Most people dismiss this as the melodramatic venting of a scorned, eccentric woman. But one person did not dismiss it. One person heard the question and realized that Patrizia Reggiani wasn't just venting, she was a client willing to pay. That person was Giuseppina Pina Auriemma. Pina was a Neapolitan psychic, a tarot card reader, and a grifter who had latched onto Patrizia's wealthy orbit. She was Patrizia's confidant, the woman who listened to her rage and read her fortune. Pina saw an opportunity. She knew people in the criminal underworld of Naples. She told Patrizia that she could solve the problem. The conspiracy was formed. It was not a high-tech professional hit planned by the mafia. It was a clumsy bargain basement plot hatched by a psychic, a hotel porter, and a small-time criminal. But in the quiet, foggy streets of Milan, even a clumsy bullet is deadly. On the morning of March 27, 1995, the city of Milan was shaking off the last chill of winter. It was a crisp, bright Monday. At roughly 8:30 a.m., Maurizio Gucci, the 46-year-old heir to one of the world's greatest fortunes, stepped out of the heavy wooden doors of his apartment building on Corso Venezia. He was dressed in a gray suit and a camel coat, carrying a stack of magazines. He looked every inch the successful modern tycoon he desperately wanted to be. He began his short walk to his private office at Via Palestro 20, a routine he followed almost every day. He did not know that his routine had been watched, timed, and sold. As Maurizio climbed the few stone steps into the foyer of his office building, a man who had been loitering on the sidewalk followed him inside. The man was Benedetto Ceraulo, a pizzeria owner from Sicily heavily in debt, who had been hired by Pina Auriemma to serve as the hitman. He was not a professional assassin, he was a desperate amateur. But at close range, skill is less important than resolve. Ceraulo raised a silenced pistol and fired 3 shots into Maurizio's back and buttocks. As Maurizio crumbled to the marble floor, stunned but likely still alive, Ceraulo stepped over him and fired a 4th, final shot into his temple. It was the coup de grace. The building's doorman, Giuseppe Onorato, witnessed the entire execution. He was sweeping leaves in the doorway. He stared in horror at the gunmen. Ceraulo, panicking, turned and fired 2 shots at Onorato, hitting him in the arm, before fleeing to a waiting green Renault Clio driven by his getaway driver, Orazio Cicala. Maurizio Gucci died in the arms of the bleeding doorman, on the steps of his own palace. The last Gucci to run the company was gone. The murder sent a shockwave through Italy and the global fashion industry. It was a crime that seemed to belong to the violent years of lead of the 1970s, not the glossy corporate 1990s. The investigation, led by the Milanese police, was immediately complicated by Maurizio's chaotic business history. The investigators initially assumed the killing was connected to international finance. Maurizio had engaged in high-stakes deals with Arab bankers, Swiss financiers, and even casino developers. Had he borrowed money from the wrong people? Was this a mafia hit related to his new casino project? The police spent nearly 2 years chasing false leads through the labyrinth of offshore accounts and shell companies that Maurizio had left behind. While the police hunted for financial ghosts, Patrizia Reggiani moved with terrifying speed to reclaim her territory. Less than 3 hours after the murder, before the blood had even been cleaned from the foyer of Via Palestro, Patrizia sent a legal notice to Paola Franchi, Maurizio's live-in partner, The order was brutal and concise: get out. Patrizia, asserting her rights as the mother of Maurizio's heirs, evicted Paola from the apartment she had shared with Maurizio. Within days, Patrizia and her two daughters moved into the luxurious penthouse on Corso Venezia, taking residence among the ghosts of the husband she had hated. To the outside world, Patrizia played the role of the grieving widow, though her performance was often cracked by her inherent narcissism. She wore heavy black veils to the funeral, but refused to remove her dark sunglasses. When reporters asked her about the murder, she gave cryptic, erratic answers. But privately, her satisfaction was absolute. On the day of the murder, she opened her Cartier diary and wrote a single word in Greek across the page for March 27th: Paradisos. For 2 years, the crime remained unsolved. It seemed destined to become one of Italy's great mysteri, an unexplained mystery. But the conspiracy was too large, too amateurish, and too cheap to hold together. The hit had cost roughly $375,000. Patrizia had paid Pina, Auriemma, who had taken a cut and paid the driver, who had taken a cut and paid the shooter. There were too many people involved, and they were not hardened professionals. They were loose-lipped opportunists. The break in the case came in January 1997. The getaway driver, Orazio Cicala, had gambled away his share of the money and was demanding more from Patrizia. He began to brag about the crime to a friend in a cheap hotel in Milan. That friend went to the police. The chief investigator, Filippo Nini, moved quickly. He wiretapped the phones of the conspirators. He captured hours of incriminating conversations. He heard Patrizia complaining about the blackmail. He heard Pina Auriemma discussing the details of the payment. He heard the hitman demanding silence. The evidence was overwhelming. On the morning of January 31st, 1997, the police launched a coordinated raid dubbed Operation Campo dei Fiori. They arrested the entire ring: Pina Auriemma, Benedetto Ceraulo, Orazio Cicala, and Ivano Salvioni. And finally they came for the Black Widow. When the police arrived at the Corso Venezia penthouse to arrest Patrizia Reggiani, she did not panic. She was defiant. She asked for time to get dressed. She emerged wearing a floor-length mink coat and wrapped in gold jewelry, looking every inch the Lady Gucci she had killed to remain. As she was led out in handcuffs past a swarm of paparazzi, she did not hide her face. She looked directly into the cameras, her eyes cold and hard. The trial, which began in 1998, was the sensation of the decade. It was more than a legal proceeding. It was a national soap opera that exposed the dark, rotting underbelly of the high-fashion world. The Italian press dubbed it the trial of the Black Widow. Patrizia's defense was chaotic. Her lawyers tried to argue that she was mentally incompetent, claiming the brain tumor surgery in 1992 had damaged her judgment. They tried to argue that she was a victim of blackmail by Pina Auriemma, but Patrizia herself often undermined her own defense with outbursts of arrogance. When the prosecutor asked her why she had hired a hitman instead of shooting Maurizio herself, she famously replied, "My eyesight is not so good. I didn't want to miss." The evidence against her was damning. The wiretaps, the financial records, and the testimony of her co-conspirators painted a picture of a woman consumed by greed and jealousy. Pina Auriemma turned state's witness, detailing how Patrizia had hounded her to find a killer, driven by the fear that Maurizio would marry Paola Franchi and disinherit her daughters. In November 1998, the verdict was delivered. Benedetto Ceraulo, the shooter, was sentenced to life in prison. Pina Auriemma was sentenced to 25 years, and Patrizia Reggiani was found guilty of ordering the murder. She was sentenced to 29 years in San Vittore prison. The Gucci curse had claimed its final victim. Maurizio was dead. Patrizia was in a cell. The daughters were orphans of a tragedy their mother had engineered. The family that had started in a leather shop in Florence in 1921 had, in the span of 3 generations, achieved absolute global dominance and then utterly destroyed itself. The bloodline was broken. But while the family was in ruins, the brand they had lost was about to achieve something miraculous. While the trial was dominating the headlines, a new king had ascended the throne of Gucci. And he wasn't a Gucci at all. While Patrizia Reggiani was trading her mink coat for a prison jumpsuit, the company she had killed for was undergoing a resurrection so spectacular that it would become the greatest turnaround story in the history of luxury fashion. The irony was devastating. The murder of Maurizio Gucci, the event that finalized the family's expulsion, was the catalyst that allowed the brand to thrive. The toxic family factor, the infighting, the lawsuits, the ego-driven mismanagement was finally gone. In its place was a cold, efficient, and creatively brilliant corporate machine, led by Domenico De Soli and Tom Ford. The contrast between the chaos of the family era and the discipline of the corporate era was stark. De Soli, the lawyer who had served the family for years, was now the CEO, and he ran the business with ruthless precision. He untangled the mess of licenses, fixed the supply chain, and empowered Tom Ford to take complete creative control. Ford's Fall 1995 collection, presented just months after Maurizio's murder, was a sensation. He sent models down the runway in velvet hip huggers and satin shirts unbuttoned to the navel. It was a look that defined the 1990s. Slick, hedonistic, and unapologetically sexy. The fashion press dubbed it porn chic. It was a million miles away from the dusty equestrian conservatism of Aldo Gucci. Madonna wore it to the MTV Video Music Awards. Gwyneth Paltrow wore a red velvet tuxedo on the red carpet. Sales exploded. By 1999, Gucci was no longer a distressed asset. It was a powerhouse. But its success made it a target. In a high-stakes corporate battle that rivaled the family's own civil wars, the French luxury conglomerate LVMH attempted a hostile takeover. De Soli, proving he was a master tactician, fought back. He brought in a white knight, the French billionaire François Pinault. In a deal worth $3 billion, Pinault acquired Gucci, defeating Arnault. This transaction was the final nail in the coffin of the family's legacy. The brand was now the cornerstone of a massive multinational luxury group. It was an asset on a balance sheet, a global icon owned by a French family, managed by American executives, and designed by international talent. The name Gucci had become fully detached from the bloodline of Guccio. Meanwhile, inside San Vittore prison, Patrizia Reggiani settled into a bizarre new life. She refused to be called a prisoner. She referred to herself as a guest. She was allowed to keep a pet ferret in her cell. She hired other inmates to clean her cell and do her laundry. She remained unrepentant, telling interviewers that she slept soundly at night. In 2011, she was offered parole on the condition that she find a job. She refused, famously telling the judge, "I have never worked a day in my life, and I'm not going to start now." She eventually accepted parole in 2016, after serving 18 years. She emerged from prison into a world that had moved on, but her hunger for the Gucci name had not diminished. In a final twist of Italian bureaucracy, an appeals court ruled that despite ordering her husband's murder, she was still entitled to the $1.47 million annual alimony that Maurizio had agreed to before his death. The court reasoned that the contract predated the crime. The estate of Maurizio Gucci, controlled by her own daughters, was forced to pay millions of dollars in back alimony to the woman who had killed their father. The daughters, Alessandra and Allegra, who had inherited Maurizio's fortune, cut all ties with their mother. They fought the alimony ruling, but the spectacle of the Black Widow collecting a pension from her victim became the final grotesque punchline of the family tragedy. The Gucci curse had run its course. It had consumed 3 generations. It had turned a hatmaker's son into a king and his grandson into a corpse. It proved that in the high-stakes world of Dynasty, the greatest threat is never the competitor across the street. It is the person sitting across the dinner table. The brand had survived, gleaming and profitable in the windows of Fifth Avenue, but the house that built it was empty, haunted by the ghosts of the men who loved it too much to share it. In the year 2024, walking into a Gucci flagship store on Fifth Avenue in New York or Via Monte Napoleone in Milan is an experience of sensory overload. It is a cathedral of commerce, a space defined by polished marble, velvet armchairs, and the intoxicating scent of expensive leather. The vitrines are filled with items that serve as tributes to the past. The bamboo bag, reimagined in neon leather, the horsebit loafer, now lined with kangaroo fur, the Jackie bag, resized for the Instagram generation. Every inch of the store screams the name Gucci. But the name is now a ghost. It is a floating signifier, a word that has been completely detached from the bloodline that created it. Today, Gucci is the crown jewel of Kering, the French luxury conglomerate founded by François Pinault. It is a corporate behemoth that generates nearly 10 billion euros in annual revenue, accounting for more than half of Kering's operating profits. It is managed by professional CEOs with MBAs and designed by creative directors who view the family history not as a heritage to be honored, but as an archive to be rated for content. The ghost of Florence haunts this success in a profound way. There is not a single member of the Gucci family involved in the company. There are no Guccis on the board, no Guccis in the design studio, and no Guccis cutting ribbons at store openings. The family has been subjected to a damnatio memoriae, a total erasure from the institution they built. When customers buy a $3,000 handbag today, they are buying the myth of Guccio, Aldo, and Rodolfo, packaged and sold by a French multinational corporation. This disconnect was brought into sharp, painful focus in 2021 with the release of Ridley Scott's blockbuster film, House of Gucci. For the surviving members of the family, the movie was not a tribute. It was a final global humiliation. Starring Lady Gaga as Patrizia Reggiani and Adam Driver as Maurizio, the film dramatized the Civil War era with operatic camp. It portrayed the Guccis not as the dignified aristocrats they had always pretended to be, but as a dysfunctional clan of bumbling, loud, and violent Machiavellians. It solidified the public's perception of the family not as titans of industry, but as characters in a bloody soap opera. The reaction from the Gucci heirs was swift and bitter. The descendants of Aldo Gucci issued a scathing public statement, accusing the filmmakers of portraying their ancestors as thugs, ignorant, and insensitive to the world around them. They threatened legal action, decrying the film as an insult to the legacy of a brand that had defined Italian excellence. But their protest rang hollow. It revealed the ultimate tragedy of their position. They no longer owned their own history. They could not sue for trademark infringement because they did not own the trademark. They could not control the narrative because they had sold the rights to it decades ago. The House of Gucci now belonged to Hollywood and Wall Street. The family was merely the raw material for the script, their tragedy commodified for entertainment, just as their leather had been commodified for fashion. The modern brand, under the creative direction of visionaries like Tom Ford, Frida Giannini, Alessandro Michele, and now Sabato di Sarno, has thrived precisely by cannibalizing the family's codes while discarding the family's values. Alessandro Michele, in particular, turned the brand into a global phenomenon in the 2010s by remixing the granny chic aesthetic, taking the old, conservative flora prints and the dusty double G logos of the Aldo era, and injecting them with a gender-fluid rock and roll chaos. It was a brilliant commercial strategy, but it was also a form of cultural necrophilia. The brand was reanimating the symbols of the dead patriarchs to sell sneakers to Gen Z. The Gucci on a hoodie worn by a rapper in Atlanta has nothing to do with the saddle shop in Florence. It is a symbol of pure wealth, a meme of luxury that has transcended its origins. Meanwhile, the surviving Guccis live in the shadow of this colossus. Patrizia Reggiani, the Black Widow, lives in Milan, occasionally spotted walking her pet macaw on her shoulder, a relic of a bygone era. She still refers to herself as Patrizia Gucci, a name she is legally forbidden to use, but mentally unable to relinquish. When asked by a reporter why she hired a hitman, she reportedly said, "It was worth every lire." She remains the dark queen of a kingdom that no longer exists. Maurizio's daughters, Alessandra and Allegra, have largely retreated from the public eye, living quietly in Switzerland with the fortune their father left them, a fortune stained by the blood of his murder and the betrayal of his cousins. They are the beneficiaries of the sale to InvestCorp, the passive recipients of the wealth created by the destruction of the family business. The cousins, the children of Paolo, Giorgio, and Roberto, have attempted at various times to launch their own brands. They have tried to sell Gucci wine, Gucci furniture, or Gucci design services, but every attempt has been met with a ceaseless barrage of lawsuits from Kering. The corporate lawyers safeguard the Gucci trademark with a ferocity that Aldo himself would have admired. They have successfully argued in courts around the world that the name Gucci no longer belongs to the people born with it. It belongs to the corporation that bought it. A Gucci heir today cannot even sell a handbag with their own last name on it without being sued for counterfeiting. The ultimate legacy of the Gucci dynasty, therefore, is a paradox of identity. It is a lesson in the ruthless arithmetic of modern capitalism. The brand is eternal, but the family is disposable. The Gucci curse was not mystical, it was structural. The very qualities that allowed Guccio and Aldo to build the empire, the domineering ego, the obsession with control, the willingness to pit brother against brother, were the exact qualities that made it impossible for them to sustain it. They built a machine that required a singular tyrannical driver, but they produced a generation of heirs who were all fighting for the steering wheel. In the crash that followed, the machine survived. The passengers did not. Today, the House of Gucci stands as a monument to the victory of the corporate over the personal. It is a warning to every family-owned empire that seeks to go global. If you invite the world into your home, eventually the world will evict you. The ghost of Guccio Gucci may still walk the halls of the Palazzo in Florence, inspecting the stitching on the leather, but the name above the door is now just a logo, a beautiful, hollow symbol of a family that consumed itself in its hunger for more. The leather endures, the style remains, but the bloodline has been scrubbed clean, leaving behind only the perfect, profitable, and empty shell of a brand that has forgotten its fathers.